So in a fairly low-key event without much fanfare, Apple has announced some new devices, some Mac Minis, MacBook Pros, and along with them some new Apple Silicon processors. So if you want to find out more, please let me explain. Okay, so Apple has released some new devices, and in doing so, it's released some new processors in its M2 range. That's the M2 Pro and the M2 Max. Now, just to kind of remember the way Apple are working with its new silicon, it all started with the M1 here. And then a little later, after this was kind of established and was in a few devices, Apple came out with the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, basically increasing the total surface area of the die much bigger because there's more CPU cores, more GPU cores, more cache and so on. So you can see how they grew up here in size. And now Apple have done exactly the same thing with the M2. We had the M2, which was announced a little while ago, and now we have the M2 Pro and the M2 Max, again increasing the die size because we're increasing the number of CPU cores and increasing the number of GPU cores. So if you remember, the M2 was an 8-core CPU, 10-core GPU, 16-core neural engine, and those CPU cores were based on, and probably the GPU cores were based on, what we find in the A15 Bionic. So the CPU cores were Avalanche and Blizzard, and those were first seen in the iPhone 13 forward. So a quick summary of the M2, 20 billion transistors, up to 24 gigabytes of RAM, built on TSMC's second generation 5nm technology, 100 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth, and compared to the M1, 18% faster CPU, 13.5% faster GPU, and could support up to 6K external displays, and they included their ProRes video codec for encode and decode in hardware. So now we have the M2 Pro and the M2 Pro Max. So the M2 Pro gives us up to 12 CPU cores, 19 GPU cores, and up to 32 gigabytes of memory. And on the M2 Max, you've still got the same 12-core GPU setup. We'll go to the details of this in a moment. Up to 38 cores for the GPU and up to 96 gigabytes of memory. So let's start with the M2 Pro. As I said, up to 12-core CPU, 19-core GPU. So here we have the same setup. You've got high-performance cores and power efficiency cores. So again, that's the Avalanche and Blizzard cores that we first saw in the A15. And to note here, the 32 megabytes of L2 cache is up from 24 megabytes of L2 cache on the M1 Pro. And the other thing is, this was 2 high efficiency cores on the M1 Pro. Now we've got 4. So this gives it a total of 12 cores overall. And then when we look at the GPU, 19-core GPU with 2,432 execution units, giving you a theoretical maximum speed of 6.8 teraflops. And so notice again, that's up from 16-core GPU in the M1 Pro. The M2 Pro adds in another 3 GPU cores. And so here's the M2 Pro overall, up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, 20% faster CPU, 30% faster GPU, supports Thunderbolt version 4, 40 billion transistors. And then we have the M2 Max. So the same 12-core setup for the CPU, now 38-core for the GPU. Let's dive into the details. So again, the same thing, 8 and 4. So again, notice the up L2 cache goes up to 32 megabytes from 24 megabytes in the M1 Max, and again you now get 4 power efficiency cores compared to the M1 Max, which gives you a total of 12 cores. And now we've got this 38 core, this absolutely massive 38 core GPU, 4,864 execution units, 13.6 teraflops, and that's up from a 32 core GPU which we had in the M1 Max. This video is brought to you by Phoenix, the super slim smartphone case company. If you've got an iPhone, you definitely want to put a case on it. Don't put a big bulky one on it that ruins all the lines that Apple have spent so much time designing. Put on a super thin one from Phoenix. Use the link in the description below to find out more. And so again, an overview of the M2 Max, up to 96 gigabytes of memory. Same CPU and GPU increases compared to the M1, 67 billion transistors, again TSMC 5nm, 400 gigabytes a second memory bandwidth. So let's just try to get all that, because there's so many different variations now. M1, M2, M1 Pro, M2 Pro. It's just, let's have a quick look. So comparing the M2 range, what have we got? Well, we're in Avalanche and Blizzard cores. So we've got 8 cores in the M2 4+4. We've got 8+4 and 8+4 in the M2 Pro and the M2 Max. So a big boost there in the CPU performance from those two, for multi-threaded, of course. And then in the GPU, we got from 10 cores to 19 cores and 38 cores, with the increase of the execution units and the teraflops, as I talked about. And the M2 can support up to 24 gigabytes of RAM. Now the M2 Pro can give you 32 gigabytes or 96 gigabytes. And as they go up here with the number of cores and the amount of memory that can be addressed, they've increased the memory bandwidth. And you can see by the die size, 20 billion transistors, 40 billion transistors, 67 billion transistors. So obviously, 38 GPU cores and 12 CPU cores. You can see just how that was more than 3 times the size of the original M2. And if we bring in the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, so you've got the previous generation, Firestorm and Ice Storm, in an 8+2 setup. Now you've got Avalanche and Blizzard in an 8+4 setup. Same again for the M1 Max compared to the M2 Max. When it comes to GPU, the M2 Max gives you 3 extra GPU cores. When it comes to the M2 Max, you've got that extra 6 GPU cores. So you can see 16 go up to 19, 32 up to 38. And then for maximum RAM, that stays the same. It was 32 gigabytes for the M1 Pro and the M2 Pro, and the same max memory bandwidth. Slightly different for the M1 Max and the M2 Max. It was 64 gigabytes maximum memory for the M1 Max, but that's now been up to 96 gigabytes. However, the memory bandwidth stays the same. And as we can see here, just the increase in the number of transistors, 33.7 billion transistors in the M1 Pro, 40 billion transistors in the M2 Pro, 57.7 billion transistors in the M1 Max, 67 billion transistors in the M2 Max. So you can see the progression here. So, the question is like here, is an M2 Pro better or worse than an M1 Max? Well, if you just look at the GPU, you can see that the GPU is 19 cores on the M2 Pro, 32 cores on the M1 Max, so better GPU. But on the CPU, of course, you've got the new generation of CPU, and you've got 12 cores, whereas you've got the older generation of CPU and only 10 cores. So there, there's a bit of a difference there. Which would you buy, the M2 Pro or the M1 Max? Though, of course, you get much more memory on the M1 Max and the greater memory bandwidth. So that's interesting. Which would you choose between those two? Of course, they're not all available in all models, so you may be restricted, if you're buying a particular MacBook or buying a particular Mac Mini or an iMac, which one you can choose may not be up to you, so you have to just go with what's available. Just like to remind you that you can follow me on Twitter and other social media sites. All the handles are here on the screen, and I also have a monthly newsletter. Go over to GaryExplains.com, type in your email address, no spam, but you will get the newsletter. Okay, now of course, as I said, these were being launched in new devices. So you've got the new Mac Mini, which comes with an M2 or an M2 Pro, Wi-Fi 6E, the option of 10 gigabit Ethernet, Bluetooth 5.3, can support up to 3 displays, up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, 8 terabytes of storage, and then much faster than the previous versions. Of course, comes with Mac OS. And then you've also got the new MacBook Pros, which gives you the M2 Pro or the M2 Max, HDMI and Thunderbolt 4. You've got a nice display, you've got better speed, 96 gigabytes of RAM in a laptop, up to 8 terabytes of storage. Of course, comes with Mac OS and the same Wi-Fi 6E and so on. So lots of new devices available there from Apple. And I must say, just going back here, a Mac Mini with an M2 Pro does seem to me to be quite a tempting option. Now, of course, that leaves one question: where is the M2 Ultra? Because after the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, we also had the M1 Ultra, which was 800 gigabytes of memory bandwidth, 114 billion transistors. It had up to 128 gigabytes of memory, 64 core GPU, 20 core CPU. Now, there are various rumors going around saying that once you got to this big number here, 20 cores and 64 cores, then there was some bottlenecks in the overall design of this Ultra Fusion architecture, sticking all those cores and the buses that you need and the caching that you need, that there were some problems at the high end. So there are some rumors that maybe there won't be an M2 Ultra. We will just have to wait and see. We can't rely completely on rumors. So let's see whether Apple ever do that. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just stick now at the M2 Max. Well, you know, kind of watch this space. Let's see what happens. Okay, so there's my overview of the M2 Pro and the M2 Max. Do tell me in the comments below, what do you think about them? Are you tempted by these new Apple devices? Okay, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.